Michael Garrett still keeps his father's last words written on a piece of paper in his wallet, though he's never shown it to anyone. "They took what was owed," Thomas Garrett said, bleeding from dozens of deep lacerations, his hands wrapped around the wheel of the 3 generations as his son held pressure on the worst of the wounds. "Tell them they took what was owed, and they left when the debt was paid." 3 days later, after the Coast Guard investigation, after the questions he couldn't answer and the silence he maintained, Michael Garrett burned his grandfather's gill nets on the shore near Anacortes and walked away from commercial fishing forever. What happened in the cold waters of Puget Sound that October night in 1998 remains officially unexplained, but Michael Garrett knows the truth about the inheritance he and his father received, and he knows that some debts carry interest across generations. The story begins not in 1998, but 31 years earlier, in the summer of 1967, when Michael's grandfather, William Garrett, worked these same waters with the same determination that would define 3 generations of his family. William Garrett was a hard man shaped by hard years, a commercial fisherman who'd survived the Depression, served in the Pacific Theater during the war, and returned to Puget Sound to build a life from the sea's uncertain bounty. He ran a 36-foot gill netter called the Persistence, working the waters between the San Juan Islands and the mainland, setting his nets for salmon in the traditional grounds his father had fished before him. By all accounts, William Garrett was a skilled fisherman, a man who understood the tides and the fish runs, who could read the weather and the color of the sky, and knew every reef and shoal in those waters by memory. He was also a man who kept his own counsel, who spoke little and revealed less, whose logbooks recorded tonnage and weather, but never mentioned the incident that occurred on August 14, 1967. The only evidence that anything unusual happened that summer was the disappearance of another fisherman, a man named Robert Chen, who worked a boat called the Silver Tide out of Bellingham. Chun was reported missing on August 15th, his vessel found drifting near Rosario Strait, with its engine running, its gill nets deployed and torn to shreds, and no sign of its operator. The Coast Guard investigation concluded that Chun had likely fallen overboard during net retrieval, though they noted unusual damage to the nets, and what the report described as significant amounts of biological material of unknown origin tangled in the webbing. William Garrett attended the memorial service, as did most of the commercial fishing community, and if he knew anything about what had happened to Robert Chun, he never mentioned it to anyone. What he did do, in the weeks following Chun's disappearance, was retire his nets, purchasing new equipment, despite the significant expense, and storing his old gill nets in a shed behind his house where they remained untouched for the next 31 years. In 1998, Michael Garrett was 34 years old, a third-generation fisherman working alongside his father Thomas on the boat. William had passed down to them before his death in 1995. Thomas Garrett had renamed the vessel the 3 Generations, a tribute to the family legacy, and he and Michael worked it together through the salmon season, maintaining the traditions and the knowledge that William had instilled in his son. They were closer than many fathers and sons, bonded by the shared work and the shared silences of men who understand each other through action rather than words. Thomas was 58 that year, still strong and capable, his hands weathered by decades of net work, his face lined by sun and salt spray, and the particular weariness that comes from a life spent earning each dollar from an unforgiving sea. Michael had his father's build and his grandfather's quiet intensity, and he'd been working these waters since he was old enough to coil a line properly. In early October, while cleaning out the last of William's belongings from the old house before its sale, Thomas and Michael discovered the gill nets in the back of the shed, still wrapped in the canvas William had used to protect them 3 decades earlier. The nets were old-style webbing, a kind that wasn't manufactured anymore, heavy-duty monofilament that had been hand-mended in dozens of places, each repair showing William's meticulous attention to detail. Thomas examined them carefully, running the webbing through his experienced hands, checking the floats and the lead line, and after a long silence, he made the decision that would define both their fates. "These are still good," he said, and Michael, trusting his father's judgment in all things related to fishing, helped him load the nets onto the three generations. The morning of October 23, 1998, dawned cold and clear, with a light northeast wind pushing small wavelets across the sound. Thomas and Michael departed Anacortes at 0530, running north toward the waters between Orcas Island and the mainland, where the late-season chum salmon were still moving. The Three Generations was a solid vessel, 38 feet of working boat with a reliable diesel engine, modern electronics that Thomas had installed over the years, and the kind of practical layout that prioritized function over comfort. Michael remembered that his father seemed unusually quiet that morning, more contemplative than normal, standing at the wheel and watching the dark water slide past the bow with an expression that Michael couldn't quite read. They reached their chosen grounds by 0630 as the sun was starting to burn off the morning mist and began the familiar routine of deploying the nets. The old gill nets went into the water smoothly, the floats marking their position in a long arc across the current, the lead line taking them down to the proper depth where the salmon would swim into the webbing. Everything proceeded normally, the engine running at idle to maintain position, the VHF radio crackling occasionally with the chatter of other boats working nearby waters. The morning unfolding with the comfortable predictability of thousands of similar mornings. They let the nets soak for 2 hours, a standard time for this type of fishing, and Thomas brewed coffee in the small galley, while Michael watched the float line and monitored the depth sounder. At 0845, they began the retrieval, engaging the net drum and starting the slow process of bringing in their catch. The first indication that something was wrong came when they found hydraulics began straining against unusual resistance about halfway through the retrieval. Thomas throttled back immediately, his experienced ear catching the change in the drum motor's pitch, the labored sound of machinery pulling against weight that exceeded normal parameters. The net drum slowed, the hydraulic fluid temperature gauge creeping upward as the system fought against whatever resistance had developed below the surface. "Might have snagged something on the bottom," Michael said, moving to the controls to check the pressure readings. But his father shook his head, pointing at the depth sounder that showed them in 60 feet of water, far too deep for the net to have reached the seafloor. "We're not dragging bottom," Thomas said quietly, his eyes fixed on the point where the net descended into the dark water. "Something's caught in the net, but it's not the seafloor." They continued the retrieval slowly, both of them watching the water where the net would surface. Thomas keeping one hand on the emergency release lever, Michael ready to shut down the hydraulics if the strain became too great. The morning remained calm, the wind still light from the northeast, but Michael noticed that the other boats they'd seen earlier had moved off, their VHF chatter fading as they worked grounds farther to the south. The Three Generations was alone now in this section of water, and the silence that settled over them felt heavier than it should have, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The net broke surface slowly, emerging from the depths with water streaming from its webbing, and what came with it stopped both men cold, freezing them in place as their minds struggled to process what their eyes were seeing. Tangled in the webbing, twisted among the silver bodies of perhaps 24 salmon, was a mass of something that didn't belong there. At first, in the confusion of seeing it break the surface, Michael thought it was kelp or debris, some kind of organic material that had been caught by the current and dragged into their net. But as the drum brought it closer, as the morning light fell fully upon it, both men saw what they'd really caught, and the temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees in an instant. Bones. Human bones. Some still partially connected by desiccated ligament, others scattered through the webbing like pieces of some terrible puzzle. The skull was there, wrapped in a section of net, the empty eye sockets seeming to stare up at them with an accusation that transcended death. Ribs, vertebrae, the long bones of arms and legs, all of them showing the peculiar pitting and erosion that comes from decades of immersion in salt water, and caught on a piece of the webbing near what had been the rib cage. A rusted dog tag on a corroded chain, the stamped metal still barely readable in the harsh morning light. Thomas reached out with a gaff and carefully retrieved the dog tag, his hands steady despite the horror of what they'd found, and read the name embossed there. Robert Chun, he said quietly, and Michael saw his father's face go pale beneath the weathered tan. "Dad, who's Robert Chun?" Michael asked, but before Thomas could answer, the three generations lurched hard to port, nearly throwing both men off their feet. Something had grabbed the net below the surface, something strong enough to pull a 38-foot vessel sideways through the water. The drum shrieked as the net was yanked back toward the depths, the hydraulic lines vibrating with the strain, and Thomas lunged for the emergency release, his hand reaching for the lever that would cut the net free. Before his fingers could close on the release, the net went slack, the tension vanishing as completely as if it had never existed. The drum spun briefly, and Thomas grabbed the controls to prevent the hydraulics from tearing themselves apart. For perhaps 10 seconds that felt like 10 minutes, nothing happened. The boat rocked gently in its own wake, the recovered portion of net hanging limp over the gunwale with its cargo of bones and salmon. The water around the three generations was perfectly still, and that stillness was more terrifying than any visible threat. Then something surfaced 30 feet off the port beam, and Michael Garrett saw his first clear view of the creatures that had come to collect his grandfather's debt. She rose from the water slowly, deliberately, her emergence calculated to be seen and understood. Her skin was the color of a drowned corpse, a gray-white pallor that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, wet and gleaming. Her hair hung in thick, dark ropes that clung to her shoulders and back, tangled with bits of kelp and other things Michael didn't want to identify. But it was her face that held him frozen, unable to look away despite every instinct screaming at him to turn and run. Her eyes were too large, black and lidless, reflecting nothing, fixed on the boat with an intelligence that was utterly inhuman, yet somehow terribly aware. Her mouth opened slowly, and Michael saw rows of needle-sharp teeth, multiple rows like a shark's, but arranged differently, designed for gripping and tearing. Below her torso, which was covered in gray scales that formed a natural pattern across her chest and stomach, her body merged into a powerful tail, silver gray and muscular, ending in ragged fins that beat the water slowly. Her webbed hands, tipped with claws longer than human fingernails, reached out and gripped the edge of their net, pulling it toward her with effortless strength. She examined the bones tangled there with what seemed like satisfaction, her black eyes scanning the remains with attention that suggested recognition. "Oh, God," Thomas whispered, and Michael heard something in his father's voice he'd never heard before, a combination of recognition and resignation. Then two more of them surfaced, one to starboard and one directly astern, their appearances coordinated with precision that spoke of communication and planning. Michael understood with absolute clarity that they had been waiting, that this had been planned, that the creatures had known exactly what those nets would catch and when they would be deployed. The one holding their net looked directly at Thomas Garrett, and some communication passed between them that transcended language, a message delivered through those black, pitiless eyes that made Thomas's shoulders slump. "Michael," his father said, his voice steady despite everything, "I need you to listen to me very carefully and do exactly what I say." "Dad, what?" Michael started, but Thomas raised his hand, cutting off the question. "William caught one of them," Thomas said, speaking quickly, his eyes never leaving the creature at their port side. "In 1967, in these same nets. He brought it aboard the Persistence, kept it on deck for 2 days, studying it, trying to decide what to do with it." Thomas paused, swallowing hard, his hands gripping the gunwale. "Chun saw it. Robert Chun was working nearby waters, came alongside to trade information, and he saw what William had caught, saw the creature suffering in the bottom of the boat." Michael felt the deck seem to tilt beneath him as his father's words rewrote everything he'd understood about his grandfather. Chun wanted to report it, said he was going to call the Coast Guard, the university, Thomas continued. He thought it was the scientific discovery of the century, but William knew that fame meant attention, meant questions, meant the end of the life he'd built. The creature tilted its head slightly, as if listening to Thomas's confession. So William killed him, Thomas said flatly. Took a gaff to Chun's head, dumped his body overboard weighted with chain, scuttled Chun's boat in deep water. Michael wanted to deny it, but the words died in his throat as he saw the truth of it in his father's eyes. Then William released the creature, but not before it had suffered, not before he'd heard it trying to figure out what it was. Thomas looked away from the creature, meeting Michael's eyes with profound sorrow. He told me about it before he died, made me promise to never use those nets again, said something would come for them eventually. I didn't believe him, thought it was just the delusions of a dying man trying to make sense of his guilt. The creature holding their net suddenly yanked it hard, tearing it free from the drum with a sound of metal shearing and fiberglass splintering, pulling a section of the gunwale away, as if it were made of balsa wood rather than reinforced marine-grade material. The 3 generations listed sharply to port, water beginning to pour in through the damaged hull with the rushing sound of the sea reclaiming what belonged to it. And Thomas grabbed Michael's arm with surprising strength, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises. "Get to the life raft," he said, his voice cutting through Michael's shock with absolute command. "Deploy it now and get in. Don't argue with me. Don't hesitate. Don't try to be a hero. Just do exactly what I'm telling you to do." "I'm not leaving you," Michael started, but Thomas shook him hard, his grip painful, his eyes burning with an intensity that allowed no argument. "You have to," Thomas said, and his voice cracked for just a moment before he regained control. "This is my inheritance, not yours. My father's sin, passed to me through blood and silence. It ends here, with me, and it doesn't pass to you. Do you understand me? It doesn't pass to you." The creature holding their net suddenly yanked it hard, tearing it free from the drum and pulling a section of the gunwale away with a sound of splintering fiberglass. The 3 generations listed sharply, water beginning to pour in through the damaged hull, and Thomas grabbed Michael's arm with surprising strength. "Get to the life raft," he said. "Deploy it and get in. Don't argue, don't hesitate, just do it. I'm not leaving you. You have to," Thomas said, and his grip on Michael's arm tightened until it hurt. "This is my inheritance, not yours. My father's sin passed to me. It ends here." The creature astern had moved closer, its clawed hands reaching up to grip the stern rail, and Michael could see more of them now, pale shapes moving beneath the surface, circling the vessel like sharks around wounded prey. Michael could see more of them now, pale shapes moving beneath the surface, circling the vessel like sharks around wounded prey. Thomas pushed Michael toward the stern where the life raft was mounted, his strength and determination overriding his son's resistance. "Tell them I paid it," Thomas said. "Tell them the debt is settled. Can you do that for me?" Michael, tears streaming down his face, pulled the life raft release, and the canister tumbled into the water, automatically inflating with a hiss of compressed gas. "Dad, please." "I love you, son," Thomas said, and then he shoved Michael hard, sending him stumbling toward the rail, toward the inflated raft that bobbed alongside. "Go, now. Don't look back." Michael went over the side, landing hard in the raft, his training taking over even as his mind reeled with the impossibility of what was happening. He grabbed the paddle, pushing away from the 3 generations, and despite his father's command, he looked back. Thomas Garrett stood at the wheel of the boat, his hands gripping the spokes, his face calm and resolved, and the creatures swarmed over the vessel like a pale tide. They came from all sides, their powerful tails propelling them out of the water and onto the deck, their clawed hands gripping every surface, their black eyes fixed on the man who carried his father's guilt. Thomas didn't fight, didn't try to flee, and Michael saw him mouth something perhaps a prayer, perhaps an apology, before they took him. It was quick, far quicker than it could have been, and Michael understood that this was mercy of a sort. The creatures taking what they were owed, but taking nothing more. The 3 Generations was sinking now, the damage to its hull too extensive to survive, and as it went down, the creatures went with it, pulling the vessel under in a maelstrom of bubbles and debris. The last thing to disappear was the stern, with the name 3 Generations still visible above the waterline, and then there was only disturbed water and silence. Michael Garrett floated in the life raft for 4 hours before a Coast Guard cutter found him, responding to the EPIRB signal that had activated automatically when the raft deployed. He was hypothermic when they pulled him aboard, his core temperature having dropped to dangerous levels, and he was in shock, both medical and psychological. The story he told, once he was stable enough to be interviewed, made no sense to the rescue crew or the investigators who arrived at his hospital bedside. He spoke of creatures with black eyes and needle teeth, of deliberate revenge enacted across 3 decades, of his father's willing sacrifice to settle a debt. The investigators listened with professional courtesy and attributed his account to hypothermia, trauma, and shock-induced confusion. The official investigation concluded that the 3 Generations had suffered catastrophic hull failure, possibly from striking submerged debris or from structural weakness in the fiberglass. The report noted that the vessel had been well maintained, but was operating in waters known for deadheads waterlogged trees that floated vertically just below the surface, and that striking one could easily have caused the kind of damage described. Thomas Garrett's death was ruled an accidental drowning, his body lost to the deep water and strong currents of Puget Sound. The investigation commended Thomas for his quick thinking in deploying the life raft and ensuring his son's survival. Michael's survival was presented as a testament to proper safety equipment and training. The investigation noted that Michael's account included confused statements about large marine animals, which the report attributed to hypothermia-induced hallucinations and psychological trauma. Robert Chun's remains, recovered by the Coast Guard from the floating debris field, were identified through dental records that had been kept on file since his 1967 disappearance. His family, after 31 years of uncertainty, finally had closure and were able to hold a proper funeral service. The investigation into Chun's original disappearance was reopened briefly, but no connection was made between his death and the Garrett family. The prevailing theory was that Chun's body had been caught in old fishing nets on the seafloor and had only recently been disturbed by current activity. It was, the investigators agreed, a tragic coincidence, nothing more. No body was ever recovered for Thomas Garrett, and after the standard search period elapsed, he was officially declared lost at sea. Michael Garrett was released from the hospital 3 days after the incident, and the first thing he did was return to the site where his grandfather had stored the old nets. He gathered every piece of that webbing, every float and lead line, loaded it onto a truck, and drove to a remote section of beach near Anacortes. He built a fire, using diesel fuel to ensure it burned hot enough, and he fed those nets into the flames until nothing remained but ash and twisted metal. He stood there until the fire died completely, watching the smoke rise into the October sky, and then he walked away from commercial fishing, from the family tradition, from the legacy that had defined 3 generations of Garrett men. He sold the house, sold his interest in the fishing permits, and moved inland, as far from the water as he could manage. He found work in construction, rebuilt his life around routines that had nothing to do with tides or seasons or the ancient creatures that lived beneath the waves. But he kept his father's last words written on that piece of paper, carried them with him like a talisman or a warning, and sometimes, late at night, he would take it out and read those words again. They took what was owed. They took what was owed, and they left when the debt was paid. In the years since that October night, Michael Garrett has thought often about what his grandfather did, about the choices that created a debt that took 31 years to collect. He's thought about his father's sacrifice, about the calm acceptance in Thomas Garrett's eyes when he understood what was required of him. He's thought about those creatures, about their terrible patience and their longer memories, about the fact that they could have killed them both, but chose not to, honoring some code of justice that humans could barely comprehend. Most of all, he's thought about inheritance, about the things that pass from father to son, the knowledge and the skills, and sometimes the debts that accumulate across generations. He's wondered how many other families carry similar burdens, how many other men have made choices that their children or grandchildren would eventually have to answer for. And he's wondered how many of those creatures still move through the deep waters of Puget Sound, how many of them remember injuries and injustices, how many of them are simply waiting for the right moment to collect what's owed to them. Michael Garrett will tell you, if you ask him, that the ocean keeps its own books, maintains its own accounting, and that some debts carry interest that compounds across decades. He'll tell you that his grandfather was a hard man who made a hard choice, and that his father was a good man who paid for it with his life. He'll tell you that the creatures he saw that morning were real, that they exist regardless of what any official investigation concluded, and that they are far more patient than any human could understand. And he'll tell you that if you inherit something from the sea, you should examine it carefully before you put it to use, because sometimes what looks like an asset is actually a debt, and the creatures that hold the note always, eventually, come to collect. The waters of Puget Sound still teem with salmon, and commercial fishermen still work those same grounds where William Garrett caught something he should have released, where Thomas Garrett paid the price for his father's choice. If you talk to the older fishermen, the ones who've worked these waters for decades, some of them will tell you stories about things they've seen in the deep water, pale shapes that move with purpose, black eyes that watch from just below the surface. Most won't talk about it at all, understanding that some knowledge is better left unspoken, that some debts are better left unclaimed. But they all know, in the way that men who work the sea come to know things, that the ocean is not empty, that it holds creatures older and stranger than any textbook acknowledges, and that those creatures have their own sense of justice, their own codes of conduct, their own long memories. Michael Garrett burned the nets, but he couldn't burn the knowledge, couldn't erase what he'd learned about the true nature of inheritance and debt. He lives inland now, far from the smell of salt water, far from the sound of waves against a hull, but he knows that distance doesn't matter, that memory transcends geography, and that the ocean remembers everyone who takes from it, everyone who harms what belongs to it, everyone who creates a debt. If you've seen something in the water that you can't explain, if you've encountered something that doesn't fit the official record of what lives beneath the waves, if you've inherited something from someone who worked the sea and wondered what else might have been passed down to you, share your story in the comments below. You're not alone, and your experience matters to others who've seen what the official world refuses to acknowledge. The creatures are real, they're out there, and they're keeping their own records of who owes them what. Subscribe to Maritime Incident Files for more accounts from the deep, more stories from men who've encountered things that shouldn't exist but do, more evidence that the ocean is far stranger and more dangerous than most people will ever know. The sea keeps its secrets, but sometimes it shares them with those willing to listen.